Hi. Yesterday I talked about the monument that Joshua had built on the west side of the Jordan River after the Israelites crossed the Jordan River, where the priests stood in the middle with the Ark of the Covenant on their shoulders, and the representatives from each tribe took a stone and they went out and they built a monument on the west side of the Jordan. But you see, that was not the only monument that God told them that they should build to remember his goodness. There's another instruction. This is in Deuteronomy chapter 27. What it says here is, it says that they're supposed to take 12 large stones to build a monument. And here's what it says, starting in verse 4. And when you have crossed the Jordan, set up these stones on Mount Ebal. Now, I want to show you what very possibly it was like around where Mount Ebal is, just kind of a barren area. But anyhow, Mount Ebal is where they were supposed to set up some large stones. It says, set up these stones on Mount Ebal as I command you today, and coat them with plaster. Also build there an altar to the Lord your God, an altar of stones. Do not use any iron tool upon them. Build the altar of the Lord your God with field stones, and offer burnt offerings on it to the Lord your God. Sacrifice fellowship offerings there, eating them and rejoicing in the presence of the Lord your God. And you shall write very clearly all the words of this law on the stones you have set up. So, we have this stone monument that's built, and what it has is plaster, or you might think of it as like adobe, that was covering it all over. Some translations say lime, others say plaster. But in the Middle East and also through Mexico and several other countries, adobe is used after a place is built with rocks. But what's supposed to be written in there, on there, is it is supposed to have clearly written all the law of God. Why? Well, so that they would remember. But not only that, they were supposed to build an altar next to that monument, and that altar they were supposed to offer a fellowship offering. This was to be a time where they gathered together as a nation and celebrated all the goodness of God. I find a few things interesting in that. First of all, to do it together, so it's a together thing that we obey and learn God's law, but also that it involves sacrifice. And the other thing is to write clearly. We want to make sure we get God's law right. This isn't the only time that God told them to remember. In Deuteronomy chapter 17, this is long before they go into the promised land, but what it says in Deuteronomy chapter 17 is this. Sorry, having a little trouble here. This says that when you get into this promised land, there are apt to be those who cry out for a king, and eventually I will let you have a king basically because of your hard-headedness. But he says, when he, the king, takes the throne of his kingdom, he is to write for himself on a scroll a copy of this law, taken from that of the priests who are Levites. It is to be with him, and he is to read it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to revere the Lord his God and follow carefully all the words of this law and these decrees, and to not consider himself better than his brothers, and to turn from the law to the right or the left. Now, if you follow the history of Israel, you'll see that what happened is they actually lost the book of the law. Not only did the kings not write down their own copy of it, because they were supposed to write it themselves, not only did they not do that, but the kings actually, and the priests actually lost track eventually of the law. Maybe we shouldn't be so surprised that the northern 10 tribes never had a godly king, and the southern tribes only had a very few godly kings. But you see, that's not all. God didn't just write his law on tablets like Moses had with the 10 Commandments. He didn't just write them on the adobe of this monument that was built. And he didn't just put them on the books of a scroll that the kings were supposed to have. Deuteronomy chapter 6 tells us that there's someplace else where it's supposed to be. These are the commands, decrees, and the laws the Lord your God directed me to teach you to observe in the land that you are crossing the Jordan to possess, so that you, your children, and their children after them may fear the Lord your God as long as you live by keeping all his decrees and commands that I give you, so that you may enjoy a long life. Hear, O Israel, and be careful to obey, so that it may go well with you, and that you may increase greatly in a land flowing with milk and honey, just as the Lord, the God of your fathers, promised you. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. These commandments that I give to you today are to be upon your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, and when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates. It is so important that we take God's law to heart, God's instructions into our very being, into our minds and into our hearts. But especially, that should result in being in our actions. But it's not just for me, because I'm supposed to impress this on my children and my grandchildren and the grandchildren after that. Today, you may not have a monument of stones in your yard, but you can have a heart that remembers all the good that God has done and all that he has promised us in his word. Teach your kids. Teach your grandkids. And you yourself learn and obey.